of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, Part 1. Alright, so before we get into this last section of the book, let's first take a look at the timeline of the Second Age as we've seen it so far. So in the year 32, the Edain who survived the War of Wrath arrive in Númenor, and Elros, brother of Elrond, becomes the first king. In the year 600, some Númenorians make their first voyage back to Middle-earth and meet the people living there. In the year 1200, Númenorians begin to construct permanent havens in Middle-earth. And during the reign of Tar Atanamir, from 2029 to 2221, he is the first king to speak out against the ban of the Valar. During Tar Ankalimon's reign, from 2221 to 2386, the King's Men and the Faithful are established. In 3117, elves are no longer allowed in Númenor, and all forms of Elvish are banned. In 3255, Ar-Pharazôn becomes king. Then in 3319, the downfall of Númenor occurs. So the kingdom of Númenor basically lasted as long as ancient Egypt, just to give you an idea of its longevity and glory. Anyway, in this part of the book, we see what happened to Sauron after the War of Wrath. After seeing Morgoth get his butt thoroughly kicked, Sauron begs Eonwe for mercy, but because Eonwe can't forgive another Maya, he tells Sauron to return to Aman and receive judgment from Manwë. Well, Sauron was respected and powerful under Morgoth, but he is way too cowardly and fearful to subject himself to judgment because he doesn't want a long, humiliating prison sentence. So he hides himself and disappears somewhere in Middle-earth. And after Beleriand sinks beneath the ocean, the only recognizable landform we see remaining from the Elder Days are the Blue Mountains. But a gulf is formed through them, and it's here that the Eldar build Mithlond, or the Grey Havens. This is where Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, and Elrond live immediately after the destruction of Beleriand. And as you know, it's from this place that any elves who grow tired of Middle-earth can depart on ships to Valinor. Other elves besides the remaining Noldor have escaped the destruction of Beleriand and come over the Blue Mountains. Sindar from Doriath, and Laiquendi from Osiriand. They eventually establish realms among the Sylvan Elves, that's the Nandor Elves, remember those guys, in the woods and mountains that are far inland. In the year 750 of the Second Age, some Noldor established the realm of Eregion on the western side of the Misty Mountains. It is located near the door of Khazad-dûm, or Moria. In these days, the elves of Eregion and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm are friends, and their mutual trade in skills and knowledge leads to both their enrichment. So this is why the door to Moria has Elvish written on it, because both elves and dwarves had a hand in making it. Now, back in chapter 19, I mentioned Celebrimbor, son of Curufin. Well, he is the ruler of Eregion, and he is the second greatest craftsman ever to have lived, his grandfather Feanor being the greatest, and he helps in construction of the door. So it's sometime around the year 500 that Sauron eventually shows up in the east after hiding, choosing Mordor for his abode. And in the year 1000, he begins construction on Barad-dûr, his dark tower. But he's not super active during this time. I mean, the places where the elves of Beleriand have set up realms are peaceful, while most of the lands are wild, and you, of course, have the Avari elves wandering around here and there. There are men in the south and the east, most of whom turn evil because of Sauron's work, unfortunately. And like Morgoth, Sauron also hates the elves and men, especially the Númenorians, who come to Middle-earth on occasion. And he also assumes that the Valar have forgotten all about Middle-earth, so he starts working on plans to take over everything. He begins by trying to corrupt the elves. So he takes on the fair form of Annatar, meaning the Lord of Gifts. This is the form he uses when he goes to Numenor before its downfall, by the way. But he doesn't go to the land of Lindon, where the Grey Havens are, because Gil-galad and Elrond just don't trust him, and they don't let him in. Even though he looks fair, he seems foul. But elves in other places receive him gladly, especially in Eregion. Annatar promises them that he'll help them create a realm akin to that in the Undying Lands. And it makes sense that the elves of Eregion would buy this line, because they're Noldor, remember? And those guys are always trying to increase their knowledge and skill. And also, they're not at peace with themselves, because even though they love Middle-earth, they wish they could enjoy the bliss of Valinor as well. So, Annatar is welcomed, and he sets to work with them. With his help, the elves make many rings of power, but what they don't know is that Sauron secretly makes his own ring of power, the One Ring, into which he puts much of his will and strength. He actually forges it in Mount Doom, which is, as you know, a volcano in Mordor close to Barad-dûr, and this is in the year 1600. Now, all the other rings are bound to the One Ring's power, so when Sauron wears his ring, he can see and control the thoughts of anyone who wears any of the lesser rings. But when he first puts on the One Ring, the elves immediately sense him for who he is, and they all take their rings off. And this makes him really angry that he can't fool them or control them. So he comes to Eregion and demands that they return the rings to him. And they don't, of course. They actually manage to hide just 3 from him. Now, these 3 rings that they hide are very special because Celebrimbor has made them without the help or knowledge of Sauron. And anyone who wields one can ward off the effects of time and weariness. They're called Narya, the Ring of Fire, which is borne by Círdan, Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, borne by Galadriel, and Vilya, the Ring of Air, borne by Gil-galad. Even though these rings are forged separately from all the others, they are actually still subject to the One Ring because Celebrimbor had used some of the same techniques to make the rings that Annatar had taught everyone. So that's why it's important that the owners never use these rings openly while Sauron still has his ring. Otherwise, he'll be able to find them. So, since the elves refuse to give him the rings, Sauron begins his war with the elves. And this lasts from 1693 to 1701. And during this time, he completely destroys Eregion. This causes the elves there to scatter. Some of them go north to Imladris, aka Rivendell, which Elrond actually founds during this war. But many others flee to the Grey Havens and sail to Valinor. They don't even bother to stay in Middle-earth. And during this war, Sauron kills Celebrimbor, and he manages to take back all the lesser rings of power that the elves of Eregion have made. These are the rings that he later gives to the dwarves and to men. You know the story. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die. Anyway, speaking of dwarves, during the war, they help the elves fight Sauron, but when they go back to Moria, they actually shut the western door behind them, and this door will remain closed until the Fellowship opens it about 4,700 years later. Now, by now, Sauron's pride and lust for power increase because he's winning the war. He wants to destroy the elves, bring about the downfall of Numenor, and take over Middle-earth. He's very busy. And people far and wide start to call him the Dark Lord, or the Enemy, and he starts gathering all the old servants of Morgoth together. These days begin the time known as the Black Years, or the Days of Flight, because many elves choose this time to leave Middle-earth for good. His shadow pretty much controls the men of the east and the south, but he still cannot control the realm of Gil-galad in Lindon. And eventually, the Númenóreans come to the aid of the elves, and together they fight Sauron and force him out of Eriador. So he retreats back to Mordor. So that ends the war of the elves and Sauron, but the Black Years continue on for the rest of the Second Age. So during these dark years, Sauron gives the rings of power to the Dwarves and Men. and all those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. His corruption proves especially effective on the humans, and the bearers of the 9 rings become mighty kings, warriors, and sorcerers in their time. But eventually, the phantoms and delusions of Sauron make them fall into thraldom and the realm of shadows. They wind up becoming his most terrible servants, the Ringwraiths, or Nazgul, and they first appear in the year 2251. This is during the same time in Numenor when the 2 political factions of the Kingsmen and the Faithful appear. So Numenor is already starting its slow decline when all this other stuff is happening in Middle-earth. Now let's fast forward about 1,000 years. Sauron goes with Ar-Pharazôn to Numenor, the downfall of Numenor happens, and Sauron's spirit returns to Mordor. This all occurs over a period of about 57 years, so it's not a really long time. But when Sauron comes back to Middle-earth, he sees that Gil-galad's realm has actually prospered and grown in influence, even over the Misty Mountains and into Greenwood the Great, aka Mirkwood. And Sauron doesn't like this, so he sits in Mordor and plans for war. And meanwhile, we know that the faithful of Numenor have escaped in ships and landed on the shores of Middle-earth. Elendil's ships are cast into Lindon, where he befriends Gil-galad. He then establishes his realm of Arnor in that region called Eriador. That's kind of where the Shire is located in the future, so that's kind of cool. You'll see some familiar names here, like Amon Sul, aka Weathertop. Remember that place? Well, Elendil has that built as a watchtower. Meanwhile, Isildur and Anarion's ships are brought further south, and they go up the great river Anduin and establish the realm of Gondor. They establish the city of Osgiliath right on the river, and this is the main city of Gondor. They also build Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Rising Moon, which will later become known as Minas Morgul, the city of the Ringwraiths, but not for now. And Minas Anor, the Tower of the Setting Sun, which will later on become known as Minas Tirith. And the House of Isildur is located in Minas Ithil, and the House of Anarion is in Minas Anor. But the brothers jointly rule over the realm, and their thrones are side by side in the city of Osgiliath. And it's during this time that the Númenórean exiles build many places that we are familiar with from The Lord of the Rings, such as the Argonath and the Tower of Orthanc. Pretty cool, huh? They also plant the shoot of the White Tree at Minas Ithil. And Elendil takes 3 of the Palantiri, while his sons take 2 each. The stones are placed in the following locations: one of the towers that overlook the Grey Havens, the city of Anúminas, the watchtower of Amon Sul, the Tower of Orthanc, Minas Anor, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil. These stones allow the Númenórean exiles to be aware of many things that their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped their vigilance in the days of their might. And actually, sometimes Elendil climbs the tower near the Grey Havens and looks into the stone there, and thence he would gaze out over the sundering seas when the yearning of exile was upon him, and it is believed that thus he would at whiles see far away even the tower of Avalone upon Eressëa, where the Master Stone abode and yet abides.